Thank you, Maggie and Greg, for coming and appearing for this interview. It's a pleasure to talk about this, pleasure to see you. I'd like to start with, first of all, acknowledging the fact that, I'm on the Sunshine Coast and you are in Fanny Bay on the island. So we're separated in a sense by a part of the ocean. And yet at the same time, here we are very close to each other. And it also brings to mind the fact that Vancouver Island, even though it's obviously a part of Canada, we know that geologically, many, many, many millennia ago, it belonged to Asia. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, along with the obvious fact that you're Canadians living in Canada, whether you feel a link at all to Asia, living where you do. Do you feel any kind of a link there? That's the first question. And if you don't, you don't. I'm just curious.
Well, I remember when I first moved here, because I grew up in Ontario, and I was speaking with a woman named Rona Murray, who was a writer, and she pointed out this very fact to me early on. And so whether I felt it or not, I sort of started looking for a bit of that influence. And in the ceramic world, of course, the Japanese and Korean potters are highly regarded. And so I don't know if I feel it, if it was in my sense of feeling or just in my awareness. But I think that I noticed that and the big nature and how much that's appreciated in Asia. We also have an Asian daughter-in-law, so I might be slightly affected by all of that to know if I feel the link. But I think through the Japanese and Korean ceramics, I reading about them and watching and listening to what the artists say about their work, I think it has affected me about the way I look at Vancouver Island, but sort of an awareness through the back door that way. What about you, Mister?
Well, I'm pretty much a native Vancouver Islander with some periods away, but I was lucky enough when I was in my teens to spend quite a lot of time at Long Beach, Tofino, that area. And I always remember thinking, well, next stop, somewhere over Asia. So I did experience the connection that we were connected, although at some distance to Asia. But I think also, I think there was something, for whatever reason, I also had kind of a connection to Japan and an interest in China, and I guess those two countries predominantly. So yeah, I would say that there's a connection there. And again, also being involved in clay and also my passion for food, I've been very interested in those two food cultures as well. So it's hardly a closeness, but there is I think there is a connection.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. I'd like to actually also bring up what everyone thinks about is where the story begins. So when you think about your childhood or possibly your adolescence, wherever, was there a point at which, and this is a question obviously to both of you, where you thought, I'm going to be a creator, rather than just, let's say, a witness, nothing wrong with being a witness, but rather than just a witness or an engineer or a marketer or a healer or something like that, I'm going to be a creator. Do you remember anything like that, a point where you realized, I am a creator and I'm going to pursue that?
Want me to do it first?
Yes, you can.
I'll give her a minute. Well, it's curious because I think I was quite naive growing up, and I think we grew up in a very protected time. the 60s. But I remember thinking that I could do whatever I wanted. And I didn't really think about the economics of things. And at a I always liked to read from a very early age. And I think in my the angst of adolescence, I decided I wanted to be a writer. And in fact, I did. That was my original intention, was I was going to be a poet, writer, something in that field. And that's what I did in my early years until university. I went to university, but I had, a connection with the creative writing department, took classes in writing, and I had a little bit of success. I had early success. People were foolish enough to publish my poems. So I think that there was that sense of, yes, I wanted to create things. And I think it became more of a practical. Somehow I think that I got scared of writing, and I don't know, I've always dealt with a few dragons, the depression and such, and I think I got scared off writing because I didn't trust. I needed a practical outlet at the time. And so what did I look at? I never saw myself as a painter. I never saw myself as an artist in particular. I looked for something I could do with my hands, and I went into clay at that time.
Okay.
And at that time, it was a toss-up between clay and working with food.
How old were you?
Were
you a teenager at that point, or?
I was, it was through my university years.
University years.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I really wanted to be a writer in my teenage years, but that changed in the next 5 or 6 years.
Okay. And what about you, Maggie? What did
Well, the earliest pictures of me are me sitting around drawing pictures, and from very, very small, that was my thing, drawing and coloring. And I was very fortunate when my father was still alive, and he died when I was 8. We traveled often to Toronto, and I would be let loose in the Royal Ontario Museum and the art gallery. My parents, I guess it was a safer time. They'd say, "Oh, the guards will look after you." And I would just take off, and they would go look at what they looked at. And I was really familiar with the Egyptian exhibits at the ROM. I'd hang around staring at I've forgotten her name now, the mummy there. And I think that would be, given the circumstances of my family life, I was sort of let to be a bit wild. And I always made things and thought, it just didn't even, there was no moment. I just did. And I guess my mom was a very creative spirit as well. And I have 2 older sisters, and one of whom is quite talented. And I hung around with her a lot. When I was in high school, I would go to Toronto and hung around at A Space, like the very first videos that were being made and things. And that was just sort of normal for me. It was later that I realized that I had been so lucky to be seeing was just life. But I suppose I was working with children, and I thought I was going to work with kids, and I was telling stories using plasticine. And somebody said to me, "You should be a potter." And that person had a profound influence on me at that time. And so I went to art school, and that's when I was given the tools to be able to maybe put more of this into practice. But I think I was just, I don't know. It wasn't an intellectual thought. It was just the way my life evolved. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting how important such comments are in the making of one's own life. When someone says something about you that you recognize, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do were there any people who acted as mentors for either of you, or was just a fortunate array of teachers? But were there mentors specifically?
I don't think I really had any mentors. I suppose in a way, I mean, I wanted to be a writer, but what I did was cook from a really early age, and I loved food, and so my mom was a very good cook, and apparently to shut me up, they'd often just sort of park me in my what do you call those chair, high chair, to watch her, and from a very early age I cooked. So I guess that's not well, yeah, I guess in a way that was my first access to cooking, and I always loved it. So I suppose my mom would be probably a mentor, but not in the writing, not really. In the pottery, not really.
Okay. What about you?
I don't think I really ever had an. Uh-oh.
What? What
We
happened?
got a different thing. Okay. I don't think that I could say that I ever had a mentor. But I did have some supporters along the way. And I think maybe my mom, she,
For heaven's sake.
uh-oh. Maybe my mother, just in that she didn't think that it was very strange for me to be going off to art school when I did at the time of my life. She was supportive in that way. And then the other, I've had kind of a very fortunate life in clay in that I had a studio. It's all that I did. I had a studio and all the time in the world to work in it. And so the supporter I had to be able to have that is sitting beside me. So I don't know if he's a mentor. I'm a bit of a diva. So,
That's good. Take turns being divas, I guess.
Pardon me?
You can take turns being divas, a male diva, a female diva.
Anyway, but certainly Craig provided the opportunity. My mom helped with that notion of, but yeah, but.
All right. So thank you. So that gives us a little bit of the context. And I, if you forgive me, on what I want to do is lay the table, so to speak, for the discussion a little bit. You're both potters, but you're also ceramic artists, and Craig, you're a chef, and so forth. So I'll leave specific questions about that, the chefing and the cooking, so forth, till later. But I want to talk about the pottery, and I want to start with some basic distinctions and what's interesting between pottery and ceramics, and what that does. And I know that it's, to me, I find it quite interesting. When we talk about pottery, we talk about something that's a lot more functional and a functional aesthetics. And when we talk about ceramics, we talk about something a little bit artier, and so forth. Like it's almost sculptural. But if I go back to an earlier time, to the, let's say, late 19th century, when William Morris was around, and I find it interesting because all of that, because John Ruskin, the poet and essayist, went to Europe and was just absolutely wowed. He wrote a famous essay, wowed by the degree of aesthetics, ordinary aesthetics, that he saw in everything, in architecture, in things like tableware, all of those. And he wrote an essay about it, and he bemoaned the fact that in Britain they had nothing like that. And he had conversations with William Morris. William Morris, of course, was fortunate in the fact that he came from family money. So he was able to indulge his dreams. And one of those was that to reintroduce the whole idea of beauty in common life. And so he chose, basically he chose ceramics, fabric design, and also I guess, a kind of publishing, bookmaking and so forth. But the biggest thing about it that I could see was that it helped to shape community. That ordinary pottery brought the values of functional aesthetics, the sharing of beauty into the community and created community. And William Morris was big on that. And of course, I know that then obviously all of that evolved into other things. But if we look at functional pottery and the degree to which it creates community, do any of those ideas resonate with you? That it's not just, hey, let's make some pots and hope to sell them. Is it also something else that comes to the way?
Okay.
Well, it's curious because potters were essentially just one of the trades that were critical in any culture, any earlier culture. Clay was the medium for vessels, essentially. So, and I think there's something about clay that gets to you and makes you want to play a little bit more than usual. And it's never everything is such an individual. No matter if you're throwing to a marker and making 100 mugs or whatever, everyone is different. It's not everyone. It sort of grabs you, and the idea to express yourself through it is, I think, pretty much a natural function. And we look at clay historically, and there's phenomenal examples, even in prehistory, of clay and expression. So I think hugely clay allows the medium to express itself, and from the earliest of scratching in clay on walls or digging it up or whatever. So I think there is, I think pottery is, for me, it was always a connection. I can always remember around Christmas, of course, you sell a lot of pots, and then you think, well, here's somebody getting this for Christmas, and it's what I did going to someone else. And the idea of sharing, I think, has actually been quite critical in my thinking about working in clay.
Well, I agree with all of what's been said, and it's interesting because I have been what one these days would be called a ceramic artist. I'm always interested in form, but I also don't have a talent for making functional ware. And anytime I would make something, it would end up with a foot that was only tiny, and so the thing would be tippy, and I just didn't have that talent. And while I've made some successful pieces in the way that I can express myself in clay, I've always yearned to make a functional piece because I love that completion of the of clay and being able to use it. I've been envious of it, but I don't have that talent. And it's certainly about, I mean, there are so many directions this conversation could go, but we of course have all handmade dishes in our home, and there's a warmth that comes from them. I notice it when I go other places where people do not have handmade dishes. They can be really beautiful dishes, nothing wrong with them, but there's a warmth. And people who come here to eat always notice it too. It's like sense of community. Craig will cook something wonderful, and then we eat them on these dishes. And I think, I actually believe it has an energy about it of warmth and community that occurs with it. And like I say, I could go on in all different tangents, but
You'll do if you want to. I mean,
well, it's curious because there's, you kind of want what you don't have. Well, I've been a functional potter all along, and I wouldn't say I was envious, but I kind of was sometimes in awe of Maggie Louise's ability to create essentially, I mean, I guess the word artistic is a loaded word, but she was less concerned with function, and I think her connection, her pieces took way more time, but I think they connected with the spirit and the aesthetics in a way that mine didn't. And of course, she was always saying, "Oh, I wish I could just make something useful." And I would say, in fact, I wouldn't say we argued about it, but we discussed it at some length at times. So, it's yeah, for me, I have always had that connection to function, even though I explore in function, but it's been something that I'm led to, and as opposed, I'm not an artist potter. I'm a functional potter, an artisan.
Right. So it's interesting. There's that argument that has been made many times that everyone can be an artist, and that functional pottery is a very basic, universal art because it can be beautiful and can be used. It has utility, and so therefore has a kind of superiority. And yet, people have in the creation of symbolic forms, forms of ceramic art, and they immediately attach themselves to spiritual interpretations, to all kinds of things like that. People look at it because it's sculptural, and they start doing all kinds of things. They want to put it on a mantle somewhere, on a pedestal rather, and
Sorry.
they're
It's
not going to drink out of it.
It's no surprise because it is the earth itself, and that sort of primal connection is there. I mean, it is the soil, and it comes about from the fire. And so, what did we know early? So yeah, if you look at most of the early spiritual objects, they were painting on the walls, often essentially clay or shamanic forms, which were definitely clay.
The other thing is that once the creations become more, I guess, sculptural, they also, I don't know how else to put this, but they also become more expensive, out of reach of ordinary buyers, much as they would like. You might say, well, it's the same thing as painting, I guess. If you can afford to buy a painting, then you can afford to buy something that's aesthetically a ceramic piece rather than a piece of pottery. You can afford that. But other people say, well, I just want to buy a mug. I just love this sculptural piece of ceramics and so forth. So I've heard that kind of discussion. When you had people coming to your studio, and I imagine, when you had a studio, did you both show at the same time? So what kind of opinions did people express other than perhaps pleasure? Did they say anything else about, did they say, oh, I'm only looking for functional pieces, or I'm only looking for satirical pieces that have political commentary?
I think people came they would come looking for a functional piece. That would be their original thing. And then if they heard there was something else, they might come. And then they were always pleasantly surprised. We had a showroom and we went to many shows and things. And I can only remember one discussion with a man who wasn't complimentary. And that was one of the things. You go out and, how many times do you go up to someone's booth and say, I don't really like this stuff, like you always get positive comments or they walk by. But there was one man who came up and looked at a bunch of my pieces once, and he said, well, I can see they're really good, but I don't like them. And we ended up having a talk for about an hour. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it, what his different perspectives were. But, and in terms of what you were talking about, can people afford the ceramic art and that sort of thing? I'm thinking, and I could be wrong, that there are countries, Japan, Korea, England, oddly enough, from what the earlier comment that you made, England, Germany, lots of places in Europe where ceramic sculpture is, and even a ceramic cup or mug, are highly regarded art forms. And it hasn't happened so much here. It's more little pockets of communities like that. But I think that we have a different perspective, except for these small pockets, than in some other countries about ceramics as art or that sort of
Right.
thing.
Well, I mean, my understanding of ceramics is that when it's an art form, it pushes into the domain of sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
It does the same
Yeah.
kind of things that, obviously smaller, usually. It does the same kinds of things as sculpture does, which means it can be, aside from being personally expressive, it also touches in the realm of ideas, and people have used it for satire. And I'm thinking of people like Robert Arneson,
Mm-hmm.
or have used it, in all kinds of wild, expressive, dreamlike ways. There are all kinds of famous ceramicists who have done this. And so people looking at that would, I imagine, get pleasure from it and learn something for it. So it's an educational tool. It helps to shape consciousness, right? The same way that any art piece would,
Mm-hmm. I
so,
agree.
and when you were making ceramics, Maggie, were you just trying to follow some impulse, or did you have the desire as well to create something that could not only touch people's feelings, but also open them up to a set of ideas? Maybe if they could be spiritual, or they could be something about the nature of the possibilities of clay.
Well, always when I've made anything right from the start, I've had an intention of what kind of a feeling I would like them to have. My early work, I wanted them to be friendly. That was my intention. And I guess as I've matured, or perhaps as I've matured, how I could look at what, you don't think I'm maturing? Yeah. Anyway, I can look at my work and think of it in a more spiritual way. Play is so technically involved that you can start with your feeling and your intention, and then a lot of the technical stuff comes into play, what you've imagined and what you wish to do. Gravity plays a huge part in it. The firings, the glaze chemistry. It's a long journey to realize something. So, um, so if there was ever an intense spiritual involvement with my work in clay, it's often been me praying sincerely, please God, make this work, or something. I don't mean that facetiously either. They'd be that. But in terms of educating other people, I have taught a few workshops, but I've never felt so inclined to do that. There are lots and lots of opportunities for people to see that, except if I'm speaking to people. I mean, clay can, like you say, it can be used in endless possibilities, and depending on how technically involved you want to get, you can make very large things, and you just have to have equipment and molds and things like that. So I think it for absolutely could be used for any expression, depending on how involved you wanted to get. I think if that answers the question.
Yeah, well, it's an open-ended question, right?
Yeah.
But I remember a ceramicist friend of mine lived in the States, said that he would involve all kinds of members in the town. He would have a clay stomp. He would order all this raw clay and invite kids and adults, everyone, and they just take off their shoes and they just stamp on almost like grapes, except it was clay to soften it up, and it became a huge party. And then he would invite some of them to shape objects and so forth. This was independent of some of the fine work that he did, but was just as important.
Mhm. That would be fun. I would have liked to have gone to that. We haven't actually done that too much.
Play stumps. Yeah.
That kind of thing, or
Yeah.
many community things in that way.
Right. Okay.
Not that we're against it, just circumstances. Mhm.
No. And do you have professional associations of ceramicists on the island that you're connected to? Is it just marketing, or does it go beyond marketing?
No, we actually belong to a Potter's Club in the Comox Valley, and there are very many people involved in it, and we have access actually to a variety of kilns, and so it's a part of our social activity, and it's a part of, I mean, we both have a lot of experience, and it's a good opportunity. We can share what we know, and Potters,
learn.
yeah, and learn. And Potters also have a long history of potlucks. Potters are good cooks
and gardeners
and
nice people.
Yeah, they're good people. Yeah, and so we have that connection in our community. There's never been a lot of competition in any of the associations we've had. It's always been, I think it's actually quite remarkable, because I've experienced some of, I worked in a university for a number of years, and I think I've been surprised by how kind and what a lack of animosity or jealousy or anything like that there is in Potters. I think it's a remarkable trade that way, or craft that way.
That's really nice to hear. That's very good.
Mhm.
Maybe now I can just switch it over a little bit to the food topic, to cooking. And then everyone knows about, good cooks and bad cooks and so forth. And some people are talented at cooking. But there's also another way of going about it, which I'd like to look at. And there's a whole art tradition, as you obviously know. And I'm thinking of Marinetti, the futurist artist, who wrote the Futurist Cookbook.
We had that cookbook once. Great.
So, and one thinks of, well, what would go into the cookbook? So obviously you want the right ingredients, and you want a right recipe which goes in with the ingredients, and you need the skill at cooking. But what else would go in there to make the perfect meal? Would for instance, would it be for everyone? Would anyone sit down at the table to enjoy it, or would there be selected guests? Would the art of conversation be a part of that meal? Would there be music? Would the table settings come into it? What exactly is part of that food experience other than the obvious cooking of the food? And have you ever fantasized or thought about something like that for yourself, the personal, not a futurist necessarily, but that personal cookbook that goes beyond just a recipe?
All the time.
All the time.
I think it would be a riot.
We've ended up having a lot of meals with people, and there's been lots of conversation, and in our house, it's very much been front of the house, back of the house. I'm the stinky cook in the background who produces the food, but for me, my dear wife's ability to not set the table in the sense of putting the knives and forks in, but set the table, the place where you eat, has been equally important. And it's very popular cooks are very popular at this time in the world, and you get a lot of praise, and then it sometimes feels like no one really notices the fact that the setting was comfortable and in conversation inducing and generous and I think I think for both of I shouldn't speak for myself, but I think generosity is something that we've always wanted to offer in those types of circumstances.
We had a wonderful dinner party a couple of summers ago when the heat bomb came. Is that what they called it? And it was so sweltering hot. And our giant ancient cherry tree had that year gave us, I'm not kidding, about 300 pounds of cherries. And it also gave us shade. And we set up tables underneath this heavily laden cherry tree and had it was a remarkable eating event, people sitting all around. And it turned out it was our neighbors who had come, and they came dressed elegantly just by surprise. I mean, here in the middle of Fanny Bay. And brought extra guests with them. And Craig made some incredible food, and it was like one of those events. And we stayed out late at night because it was so hot, and the cherries were hanging above our heads. And
that's special.
It was wonderful. It was just terrific. I love that meal.
It was a sensual experience, and I think that the food helped, but many other things made in.
Well, it started with the bounty of nature, cherries, and you just took it to another realm, so it's
it was great. And the heat also, it had been so oppressive. And as the evening went along, it got more and more bearable. But it was that was a very memorable dinner.
There's something about food, obviously a necessity, but beyond that, the idea of feeding others automatically lends itself to symbolic interpretations, giving something to other people. And everyone, at least I would assume everyone, appreciates good food and being fed. Although I guess some people are extremely fussy or extremely challenged. But other than that, they appreciate the effort and they appreciate the transformative experience of it, right? So that's a really interesting idea. Food that transforms people.
We were lucky. We saw an exhibition by a Chinese painter named Li Jin, and you walked into the place, and there was about a 40-foot by 5 or 6 foot, essentially scroll unrolled on a very long set of tables, and it was a banquet. And
a calligraphy,
but wild calligraphy, and then illustrated. The dishes were illustrated and also, I think, explained to some degree. And it was an absolutely amazing thing. And I remember reading that for Li Jin, who was in communist China, it was for him, it was his only way of revolting against the oppression of his culture was in food. And
this wonderful novel by Itzhak Dinesen and later movie called Babette's Feast.
Oh, yes.
In which this a woman who's a chef spends her life's savings creating a meal for I guess this village of people. And they're all utterly miserable folk and so forth, and somehow they're transformed by her meal, and they mostly seem unaware of it completely. It's a wonderful film. So what other than, I guess it's obviously symbolic. To what extent is it also literal when one thinks not just of food but of art?
Well, I can say we have spent our life savings on meals before.
Unfortunately, life savings weren't too big.
But you know what I mean, like transforming people. It doesn't have to be, when one says transforming, I don't mean like forever. It might be a temporary phenomenon, but that people somehow feel changed as a result of that experience.
Well, having been the happy recipient of many of Craig's meals, I have actually witnessed that coming together and happiness of a communal meal. When our son was married in our backyard many years ago, Craig put together an incredible feast, and it was a very simple wedding, a beautiful sunny day in our backyard, but the food, everyone was so happy while they were eating it, and we were relaxed, and the setting was great, but people would go along and they'd say, this is so good, and people were laughing and so delighted. And even not that long ago, we had a neighborhood meal here, and we ended up all sitting around the table, and I don't know, the food just makes, I guess it's a sensual pleasure that brings up the endorphins, or certainly conversation, sort of greases the wheels. And I think it actually is a thing that goes into people and comes out in joy often.
Well, you always see those big family meals in Italian films. It's kind of the.
Yeah.
I remember. I don't know if they're always so wonderful. I remember my first chef said that he was half French, half Italian, and he said, if there's not a fist fight among the brothers at Christmas, it's not a good meal. But that said, I'm always the one in the kitchen because I don't really like to talk that much. So I think there's more to it than the food. I think there is. I think the energy is important, and yeah, I think there can be good energy from food, but there has to be the willingness to be engaging in that kind and generous sense of energy. And that's not always the case. Maybe a lot of the time we're too strung out in daily life for that to happen. But at the same time, certain things, the odd drink, maybe good food, a good situation, sun, all those things, they kind of prod us onto the happy spectrum, and good things can happen in that way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned conversation. I mean, that's important too. And obviously make a distinction between chit chat and conversation, right? And there's conversation, and then there's conversation. And when I mean the second one, when I say conversation, I don't necessarily mean something that is particularly intellectual or educated, but something that's certainly thoughtful and inclusive and extends itself beyond just an expression of feeling, where you feel like, oh, I'm on a temporary journey using words and my engagement with these other people, that kind of stuff. And I personally remember such conversations. And I think it's interesting to include that as part of the art experience. Food, it's easy to see how that can happen because everyone eats food, and there's an immediate physical payoff. What about art? Like, for instance, what about ceramics? Since you're both working with ceramics, is there a sense in which you can create something using ceramics or pottery that engages people beyond the simple utterance of, oh, I like that?
Well, I certainly experienced that. I've experienced it with paintings. I think often people have had that experience of, I've wept in front of paintings before, right. And I've talked to people who have had that engagement with some form of inner connection with a piece of art, and I have had that with ceramics myself. And I don't know if it's as common. I haven't experienced meeting that many people whose hearts leap at a certain piece of ceramic art as often as maybe with paintings or sculpture. And I can only hope that that happens when someone encounters, even if that happened with one of my pieces in my life that I made, I would be happy. I try to be I'm a hand builder. My work is made very, very slowly. I have to pay close attention at all times to what I'm doing, and I feel blessed to be able to do it, and I hope that will come out in the end. But then there's all the other firings and things that can come along and mess it up.
Well, Maggie Louise has had fan mail from people who bought her pots from far away, saying, and I think for me, having been a sort of the artisan as opposed to what I would call an artist, my work is produced faster. I mean, we know people who make pots while watching TV. I don't think so. It's about what's loaded in the image. I think loaded is a good word. What's it loaded with? Well, maybe there's more of the spirit. Maybe it's the slowness, but also I think it's the attitude that you take. And also, I think I think people who do things with the right approach can put spirit into form. And we have many pots lying around. And I think over the years, you find ones that stay with you and ones that don't stay with you. And why is that? What's the difference? It's not necessarily quality in terms of form or anything like that, but something is present that is not present in other work. And I think that's true of painting as well. So maybe it's true of all art, sculpture, I'm sure, but that notion of, I don't know, there's that connection between human beings that exactly the same connection we're talking about with food or with anything else, but it's that connection to the oh, well, I'm stumbling here, but the connection to the human spirit, I think that can happen.
I wonder about handwork. Certainly, I've heard it said and experienced that, you've got something you're worried about and it's better to write it, to get it out using your hands. And I find, when I'm working with my hands, there's a kind of engagement that is beyond my ability to express. And I wonder if, that energy Craig is talking about is present in handwork, whatever it is, textiles, painting, massage, with the intention, but there is that touch between people using their hands and maybe other body parts. Sometimes people roll in paint, but
Right.
you know what I mean. But usually
with their hair, so
yeah, exactly. But I think that maybe there is a transference of intention through that.
But
perhaps
there is art that comes from the head, and there's art that comes from the soul.
right.
There are many. There's many places in the art world where I'm being too cerebral. I remember at one time in my career cooking, I was really into very fine, refined, specific food, and someone whose opinion I valued very highly. She came to a special function, and I asked her what she thought of the meal, and she said, well, it was the most cerebral food meal I've ever had. And I thought about that, and actually that's when my career took a turn, because for me that was not what I wanted. That wasn't my connection to the food. And I thought, well, you've gone sideways here, and let's get back to the real thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it should be a body experience, right? So not just a head experience. Go ahead, Maggie. Yeah.
I was going to say, certainly in ceramics, if we're talking about it specifically, because of its technical difficulties, I think I have felt, looking at pieces, that someone has made it because they could, and something similar to what Craig is talking about, you know, well, I could put an extra 4 loops on that handle and have it way the heck out there. And that seems to be the intention of it more than some other thing that connects with me anyway. I have seen that many times, and that my reaction has been that, like, oh, well, yeah, fancy, but
Yeah. Well, I guess the more that ceramic art exists in the sculptural realm rather than the utilitarian realm, rather than the functional realm, the more it has that, the danger, I guess, of it is that people don't know what to do with it unless they can appreciate it as a sculptural piece. You know, they say, well, I can't put anything in this, you know, not a container,
yeah.
that kind of thing. But then I think of also this, some of the, especially with, let's say Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, the social dimension of that, and how, of course, that was specifically feminist and feminist history. But my gosh, what a transformation of opinion, how it generated opinion. Not all of it positive, some of it was negative and so forth, but it certainly provoked a lot of discussion. And it was an installation piece, but it used ceramics as well as, you know, other things in order to make its point. And so to me, that was enormously successful. It looked beyond just creating one thing, you know, like whatever that one thing was. Instead, creating something much larger, something that would have a social or political focus.
Absolutely. I know many people who saw that exhibition and went, you know, were very affected by it. I didn't, but
that was in the 70s, you know, so that's a long time ago. But
yeah, we were
now
far on the other side of the country at that time.
Do you see anything now that comes close to that in the potential to create engagement with and you know, get people talking and touch their feelings, touch their minds on any level?
Well, I mentioned the Li Jin, but that long scroll of the banquet. But I don't know. Also, I guess we had a very dear friend who was a very good, I guess you'd call a ceramic artist, and in his really late years, he produced work that really spoke out, and I kind of wonder if age and experience there are certain benefits to being young, lots of them, but with age and experience, at least for me, I think I was naive and unthinking in my young days, and now I think I'm starting to get something of a perspective. It's sure taken a long time, but I feel sort of more comfortable in my soul, and I suspect I'm interested in old people's work. I guess because I'm getting up there too, but I find it very interesting. I find the connection is easier for me with people who've been around a while and see what they've got to say. There's a certain brashness in young art, and of course, what's popular? Well, the art of the youth. But I don't know. There's something to be said for having been on the earth for some years too.
I'd agree. We live in the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island and have been engaged with our garden and different things, family, and haven't traveled a lot to actually go to live exhibitions, but so there hasn't been anything we've seen. I mean, in the past, I've seen exhibitions of work from Japan, big bodies of work and things that have been amazing to see. But every time I've gone to a ceramic exhibition where even if people are putting out many individual pieces to sell. That some of them might be, to my mind, terrible pots or undeveloped or beginner or whatever, and some might be wonderful, but I am always struck by the energy that has gone into, enthusiasm that has gone in to this person's work to come and bring it out. And it's always so scary to put it out in an exhibition. We recently were at the North Island College Potters Guild, and the second year ceramic students had their work all out, and they had only had ceramics maturity. It takes years to learn, and you never do. You could be alive 35 times and still have a universe of exploration because of the firing temperatures and the clays and blah, blah, blah. So these people had not that many years behind them, but when I walked in the room, I just kind of went, wow, all these people putting their heart and soul into this. It was very sweet. I enjoyed that a lot. So it isn't a big Judy Chicago expression, but there was an expression of their humanness, I think, and sincerity that I felt from that recent exposure to a small exhibition. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What future projects are you looking forward to?
Well, Craig has been involved with the Potters Guild for longer than me, and in the Comox Valley, we're lucky to have access to different kinds of kilns at the college that we don't have here. So, as I say, the firing temperatures, the fuel, everything is important beyond the actual making of the piece. And each of those specific atmospheres and things has an expression of its own, and you need to learn it. And Craig had been firing in a salt kiln there and soda kiln, and I joined in recently and got this tiny little piece out, and I'm all pumped up about it. And so I look forward already next year to making, because it's closed in the summer, to making some pieces for the salt kiln or soda kiln. And also Craig has over the years collected things to make a small one in our backyard. So I'm excited about that.
But also we've talked about, so we used to have joint shows, and then I went off and became a stinky cook and et cetera, et cetera. And so now I'm back making clay. So we've talked about having kind of one last kick at the can with a joint show. And so with the idea that in a couple of years we'll save our best work and who knows after that, because clay is heavy and it's cumbersome and it takes a lot of space, and we're not getting any younger. So so things may change. I tie flies. They're only this big. A lot easier to cart that stuff around. Louise has she might go into paintings.
I'll try, not into it,
but
retirement.
We don't
flowers,
know. We don't know. But kind of that idea of the one last show seems like something. Seems like a good. I mean, it's not a bad thing to have some kind of a deadline. This is pretty loose one, but but I think that would be something we want to do.
Mm-hmm. And earlier in the discussion, I said my first pots, I wanted them to be friendly. And then I went through different ideas of intention as I was building pieces. Sometimes it was people would say, oh, your work is so quirky. And so I went through a time when I thought, oh, I want to make serious pots, blah, blah, blah. But these last ones, I realized that there was a warmth, and that the intention of the last pieces I make I've come full circle. I want what I leave to be, because ceramics never goes away. That's the scary thing about it. I'd like them to be friendly again and greeting to whoever finds them in the future. Actually, sometimes I put greetings inside pieces before I put them together in case they break. Hey, or something. So anyway,
Well, instead of a message in a bottle, it's a message in a pot, right?
yes, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know what I guess there's this old notion, it's a cumbersome word, but interdisciplinarity, which is like just being able to work with people in different other forms of art or different other forms of engagement. Does any of that interest you, or have you ever done anything like that?
I have had that inspiration coming on more strongly because I don't have the I mean, while I could make pots and go out to sales and things, as I haven't been doing that. I've had a couple of shows in the last 8 years or something, but that necessity or that part of my career seems to be over. And so then you wonder, why why would I make all these pots? And so the notion of teaching a few workshops or even within our Laddie Hand group, doing some things if they're interested, just to hang out together and make things with our hands and see what comes up. And not always in clay. It doesn't, it has to work also. But yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a bit. And then also maybe making things to donate to fundraisers, and sort of a different way to use my work rather than just to put it out and sell it. So that's been really coming up in my feelings.
For years, we talked about having a kind of a work. We live on, well, a rural property, and there's a river behind us. And one of the things that's always interested me is foraging. And I think we've talked about the idea of combining foraging, food, making stuff from whatever's sort of an environmental art thing, maybe digging clay and pounding it into some kind of dishes and
having a dinner party
at the end, having people do that.
Cool.
And the place, I mean, it's Judy Chicago's exhibit was essentially a table with place settings. And so that idea of combining the food and the making of the utensils and ingredients from basically raw foraged product has always been kind of fascinating. I don't know if we have the energy for it or not, but it's always been an idea that seemed very potent for us.
It would be really fun. It would take some time. We'd have, where would people sleep? It wouldn't be able to be a one-day event for sure. So, but it would sure be a wonderful thing to do, I think. Big daydream.
Yeah. Well, there's, I guess, the notion one feeds people purely for social, personal pleasure. One also feeds them as a charitable gesture, but there are also people who feed others as a part of an artistic venture as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of an interesting idea, because I would think that it's a tricky thing to do unless you know what you're doing with the food and the feeding.
Mm. Here's a weird story, because I taught in a university, but a trade university. We had a big program, and we had a part about meat cutting, and a lot of people would think, I don't want to do that kind of stuff. Basically we had pretty young people, lots of vegetarians. They didn't want, they thought this was a horrible thing, but an odd thing happened, because there was a big long table, and essentially you're cutting up an animal, and for some reason it was kind of, there was something primal about it, about engaging humans at a level, because more people than not came away from that liking not the process of meat cutting, but it engaged them in a certain way. And the instructor, who was a formidable kind of a guy, was always amazed at what would come out from people's mouths about they would be in an exposed position emotionally while doing this. It was kind of like hanging around the fire in Neanderthal or times, or consuming the day's hunt or something like that. It was a very interesting experience. So I always thought that the idea of making everything, yes, it would take time. Oh, by the way, Ramon, it says we have only 55 seconds left.
Okay, so let's finish it up.
Okay. Oh, or is that a 9? No, 49 seconds. So anyway,
It's been fun.
yeah, that notion of that's got me really a lot more excited about that thing that we used to talk about and have put on the back burner. But maybe that will happen.
I think I'm
look
always
forward to
into it. Yeah. Okay. Thank
You
you.
could come.
You can
Thank
come.
you. Okay, I will.
Yeah,
Thank you, Craig.
okay.
Thank you, Maggie, for this.
It's fun
Great.
to talk to you.
And
Well,
I'll let you know when it's all put together and in a viewable form.
okay, great. Well, I hope you have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.